Alright, so this is one that took me by surprise. An actual critique thread of the Mushroom Man himself. What are your biggest criticisms of Nasu's writing? So I think we all know that Nasu has his fair share of flaws as a writer, as does everybody. So I want to ask you all, what is your biggest personal criticism for his writing? It can be literally anything that you guys thought he should have done better. For me personally, his biggest flaw is the boring way he delivers those long and bloated exposition and info dumps. The boring exposition dumps are the reason that I dropped the Fate route on my first playthrough. By the way, if you haven't already, make sure you guys sign up for the Patreon. You get access to early content and priority on your request. So we're gonna get into it and these comments as usual. I will start off this time by addressing this first comment about him having this bloated exposition. I'm gonna be honest with y'all, I can't bear a lot of people's writing. I'm not like a huge reader, but when I do read, Nasu is one of the only writings I can actually stomach. That's why I get so hyped when I know that he's behind it, because I know that I'm gonna at least walk away with something. I really don't have that many nitpicks about it. The only nitpicks are kind of an extension of what this guy is saying. It kind of goes into something else, but it also is ironic because that's exactly what I feel like makes his writing good in the first place. So it's a real give and take situation as opposed to what other writers tend to focus on. Like this very comment itself, the boring exposition dumps, that never struck a chord with me. And I see this quite a bit. Oh, it's so boring that I can't get through it. And it's like, okay, the fact that you gotta force yourself to get through his writing, you probably don't like his writing in general. Like it's never been a circumstance of I hated Nasu's writing so much that I just had to push myself through it. It's more so of I believe that he has this idea of what he wants to say, and he's also went into this in several interviews. If he doesn't say it exactly how he frames it in his head, it bothers him. And so you end up having a lot of excess information where sometimes it isn't really necessary, but that information is never enough to make me feel like, oh, this is just unbearable in its entirety. I mean, you guys have all seen it. You've seen the stack of drafts for LB6. It's miles high. The guy puts in a lot of backbone into his work. And to an extent, I do agree. But to me, it's unfair to say that that's only the flaw in his writing, when if he didn't have that exposition, well then you would say it's shallow, you'd say it's superficial, there's nothing to it, there's nothing unique. I mean, the whole idea of what Nasu's writing is founded upon, him doing these multiple routes, him having all this extra information in the materials and things that you have to seek out that other writers normally wouldn't do, they just give it to you. That's part of the gravitas. That's part of the reason that makes it so compelling is the exposition. It's not the fact that he doesn't write extra, it's whether or not you find it interesting in the first place. So when you talk about these boring info dumps, just remember that's his main lane, and I talked about that before too. When Nasu gets in his pocket, that's where I feel like he's his strongest. First comment, not just Nasu, but all the Type Moon writers have this inconsistency where 1 second they assume the audience doesn't know what a servant is, and then the next they talk about ORT like it's common knowledge. Now I saw this when I was going through these before, and as I think about it now, I get where he's coming from. I just hate that he used this as an example, and the fact that this got to the top says that a lot of people agree with him. But I also feel like he could have used a way better representation of this. A lot of people don't know what a servant is, and they're still asking. Just because you know what a servant is doesn't mean that the next person does, or doesn't mean that somebody didn't just discover Fate yesterday, because that's the thing. Even in the context of FGO, you may feel like that's some type of dissent on his behalf, but that's really a you problem. You're too deep in. You can't get mad at other people because you're too deep in, and you've been a fan for 5+ years, and you know majority of the things. Oh, I'm tired of seeing it so much. But what really bothers me is what he says, they talk about ORT like it's common knowledge. I know what he's getting at. But even in the context of ORT doesn't get brought up that much for you to even say this. So I'm trying to figure out, what are you trying to say? Because ORT comes up in the notes of the Dead Apostle Ancestors, the original batch, when Tsukihime first came out. That was 20 years ago. ORT comes up in notes. ORT comes up in LB7, and in Strange Fate, they don't even mention ORT by name. When Zelrech talks about ORT, he refers to it as the spider. They never even say ORT. This goes into one of the bigger problems I feel like in the community. You're fighting ghosts. Who's bringing up ORT like it's common knowledge? You guys got to give context for these random blanket statements that y'all give. Now, I will say they can explain things better at times, but the whole allure is that you don't know, so you eventually find out most of the time. If not, I do feel like certain ideas can be better addressed that only get revealed in areas like the side materials or the interviews. If you're not looking into that, you have no idea. That is an issue, right? Because then people don't know what they're consuming. Next comment, name localization. Altria is so fucking weird when Artoria is an option that I know some of the games use. Yeah, I remember when this first happened, when they brought out the Altria thing. If you don't know, for the longest of time, the West could only get a hold of a fan translation for the Fate Stay Night novel. And to this day, it's really the same way. When they translated Saber's name, it came out to be Artoria. And even by Nasu's own admission, that was the general consensus back then. FGO comes back around over a decade later, and then he springs out this idea that no, her name is actually supposed to be Altria, and everybody that's been calling her Artoria for more than 10 years is supposed to just roll over and accept that. Very strange thing to change, especially after so long. If you were so invested in her name being this, you should have just made the official translation in the first place so people wouldn't have to go through this. But honestly, I'm not really thinking about this that heavy for this to be a huge criticism of Nasu. A criticism, yeah, but biggest? Not really. Until he brought this up, I honestly forgot that was even a thing. Because when people bring up Altria, I mentally check out. Like, I literally don't even take that serious. It's been Artoria. When we bring her up in conversation, that's always what it's gonna be anyway, so I'm not finna sit here and pretend like that's a big deal. And even if it is Altria, I am not big on the grammatical or the pronunciation side of the translation arguments. I can't stand them. I know people love them. It really gets into what I feel like is a waste of time when you want to debate and argue about things that really, I'm not going to say it doesn't matter, but it takes way less precedence over the actual meaning behind the character itself. You worried about the semantics of a name. For years, and you got to understand, I do a channel and I've done lores in the past, and I've had people come on here and say, well, actually it's pronounced like this. Bro, you gotta understand, I don't give a fuck. I really don't. As long as I get the meaning behind, you can tell somebody else that cares about pronunciation and all that jazz. As long as I get the actual meaning behind the character off, if I say it wrong, I say it wrong. It is what it is. Etymology and just the pronunciation of names is a very complex thing to begin with. Chances are you're trying to correct somebody else and you're saying it wrong your damn self because you weren't around when that name officially came out in its original form. So how are you sitting here so adamant about what the translation would be? I could understand if you're an actual translator or you're a native, you might feel a certain type of way because you really know. That's different. These guys aren't even that. They just want something to talk about. That's who I'm referring to. The next one, maybe I'll get a lot of downvotes. I don't think Nasu deals well with the issue of sexual abuse in some of his works. The fact that this aspect is repeated in some of his works itself bothers me. Sometimes it seems like a crutch, an easy way to demonstrate how a female character suffered. Okay, so this guy is absolutely right. I don't know exactly what scenes that he's referring to in particular, but as a longtime fan, Nasu writes a lot of abuse. He writes a lot of predators. Many people that only intake Fate may not know, but if you go into his other works, there's at least some type of a predator in most of his works. And a lot of times it's a handful of them. Now, I don't know Nasu from a can of paint. Again, he's very choice about what he decides to reveal to the public, as he should be. Nothing wrong with that. We can take the base series for example. Shinji's a pred, Zokin's a pred, Natalia's a pred, Gilles de Rais. There's the scene that I've showed you guys before where Ilya, out of her own mouth, told Heracles to prey on Ren and Saber if he wants to. It's a very, very common thing, and sometimes it feels real misplaced and even forced upon characters when it really doesn't need to be. It feels like he's trying to make the characters abominable or push the narrative or whatever he's trying to go for, when it really just comes off as this additional shock factor for the sake of so. I'm glad that he's toned it down as of the past years because Fate has become more popular. It's not necessarily ideal for him to move forward with him doing that so indiscriminately. At least now when he does it, there's much more basis. But I definitely noticed that too. That is weird. Does that hold back his writing? Sometimes. It depends on the character, because once a character gets into that vein, then they become just that. They could have had a ton of potential, but now that you've made him this, that's all people are ever gonna see them for. So you ruined it in that aspect by driving this so hard. I've seen a few people bring up the Shiki Arkaway scene. He does this with the main character of Tsukihime, and then also has him walk off into the sunset with the same heroine. Huh? In what world does that happen? Just for the sake of him pushing how mentally twisted Shiki really is. That's what I mean. The next one. The most common criticism I see is that his writing is kind of bloated. The interesting thing though is that this literally only applies to Fate. That's not true. Again, and this person kind of brings up the very point that I was making. It's only bloated if you want it to be. If you accept the writing, then you're not calling it bloated. You just enjoy it and that's it. He does it everywhere. He does it to this day. Even in FGO, there's a lot of things where you would debate, was this really necessary? Tsukihime, Kara no Kyokai, and Mihoyo are all very tightly written with very little meandering and exposition. And I don't see how anyone could argue otherwise. I mean, it's easy to argue otherwise when they all focus on completely different things. So of course the writing's gonna feel different, but he still does the same thing. I would say that Kara no Kyokai is the tightest just simply because it's a very serious series by nature. But if you think Mihoyo isn't meandering, if you think Tsukihime isn't meandering, just like Fate, it's just whether or not you accept it, you must really like those series more than Fate. And a lot of people do. Usually when somebody prefaces with this type of notion, they like Fate the least. Even with Hollow Ataraxia, despite being very long with all the slice of life scenes, it's actually very tightly written and focused with the main narrative between Angra, Bazette, and Karin. So I think the reason why that criticism is the most common is because Fate Stay Night is his most popular work by far. I think a lot of people that get into Fate aren't used to reading much. They're used to series that are adapted from mangas or very short stories in general. Like, you gotta understand, for example, one of my favorite mangakas, Tagashi, that's the guy that made Yu Yu Hakusho and Hunter x Hunter, if you don't know. He is very heavy on exposition, very heavy. He's so heavy that he might as well write books himself. And if you're not into that, you won't like it. If you're not into picking things apart and the series being a slow burn and everything unfolding eventually, you're not gonna like it. It's not for you. I think people are misled by the veil of the servants, misled by this veil of the supernatural and all these cool powers, and forget what the base of the series actually is. That's why everybody likes El Malloy so much, because compared to Stay Night, it feels so tight when it gets to focus solely on those things. And you remember what Fate is supposed to be all about, the complexities of these systems and these families and these political ties at the clock tower. And then there's the servants. Everybody just wants cool powers. There's plenty of series that do that, which leads the mass majority into thinking that's a problem. It's not a problem. You're just not used to it. You're used to these anime or these series that don't really dive deep, or they don't really give a lot of context of what's going on. They just let things happen. So it throws you off to have somebody that's really getting into it, that's really explaining it. Is he gonna step on his own foot at times? Of course. Any and everybody knows that eventually when you write so much or you talk so much, you're eventually gonna put your foot in your mouth. And what I mean by that is, for him to explain so much, he has to impede on his own writing eventually. It's like a songwriter that's been writing for 20 years and somebody says, hey, you said that 10 years ago. Well, no shit. I've been writing for 2 decades. I might say the same thing over again. It's senseless. They have no sincerity to that at all. They just think about it, again, as I always say, consumer brain. They're only thinking about it from the perspective of being a consumer. They're not really thinking about the reality of his writing or being a writer in general. Now, if he didn't have this exposition, then it would just be the run-of-the-mill anime series that you see every seasonal, and you'd make fun of him for that too. So which one is it? Pick your poison. Personally, I would say Nasu's writing has changed a lot over time, so it is hard to pinpoint any one criticism. The OG Tsukihime had great ideas, but felt rushed, underdeveloped, and kinda amateurish in places. It is still great though. That's true. I don't know about rushed, but amateurish, yeah. I mean, he was just starting. It was amateurish, but it's supposed to be amateurish. Him and Takeuchi were just getting their feet wet. Fate Stay Night goes the other way, where all of his ideas are fully developed, but it is just kind of unengaging a lot of time with some of the plot threads and all the exposition scenes. I also felt like Nasu was trying too hard at points, but again, it is still absolutely amazing. Between Mihoyo and the Tsukihime remake, I would say Nasu has struck a perfect balance and his current writing is near flawless. I do not have any substantive criticisms of either. Yeah, he's tightened up. If you haven't seen the Tsukihime remake, you're missing out because it is really good. It was already good before, like he was saying, but everything that felt like there could have been just a little bit more, he delivered. But here's one thing that I think people don't understand about Nasu. This is a smart man. You might think it's crazy for Nasu to go from his consistency of writing to LB6, but that's just what he does. If you think Nasu is excessive in his writing, and then you read Tsukihime remake and you still feel the same way, his writing just isn't for you. And people that follow my channel know, you guys saw the Dead Apostle video I did, right? That was 50 minutes long. Not 50 minutes of me repeating things, 50 minutes, and I left several things out. I gave you a whole hour of a breakdown of Dead Apostles without repeating myself. That's not bloat, that's clarity. Am I saying that he doesn't bloat at all? Of course not. He definitely does. But what I'm saying is, he knows his audience. When they run the polls, you see what makes it to the top. This quote unquote bloated or extra long writing that people swear up and down that makes them drop the series ends up being what's at the top. Why? Because that's his best pocket. I definitely do feel him on the Nasu trying too hard at points though. And you know exactly what points those are if you're used to his writing. But his newer content, I'm telling you, man, he's getting busy. I also feel similarly about Kara no Kyokai. At least the movies, haven't read the novels. Nasu has shown to be a writer who continuously self-reflects and looks to improve his writing. And that's what he should do. As a writer, he should only model after his previous works. I mean, if he's not looking to close the gap, then either he was satisfied with what he had in the first place, or he's just not in tune with his own content. But you can tell when he talks about his own stuff, he can't stand the idea of not getting across his point the right way. And I think that's just a bullet that you gotta take as a writer or just a creator in general. You can only do what you're capable of doing at that time. You can't do any more than that. And I think he understands that, and he just takes the good with the bad. If the bad has to be, hey, you talk too much, then that's just what it is. If the bad of Nasu is that he talks too much, and we end up with all these phenomenal works like Notes, Stay Night, Mihoyo, Tsukihime, I'll take that. And you guys already know I'm the first to critique. If I see something weird, I'm saying it. I know a lot of people are drones and they worship these authors, allow them to do anything that they want because they make them their champions and their icons in their mind. I call it like it is. And even then, for Nasu, it's usually not that bad. The next one, exposition not respecting the reader's time, leading to worse pacing throughout. Now here's an actual issue. Not exposition, pacing. Where and why he chooses to say the things that he says. I'm down with that. Because there are times where it feels like the exposition could be necessary in a different place. Or if you are going to give the exposition, you can continue to really bring it to life. Which is also something that gets addressed with his newer works, as we can see. Poor H scenes, obviously. That's not a problem. Okay, here's my thing about these H scenes, and I've been wanting to discuss this for a while. I read the original VN first, before I read Rialto Nua. So naturally, I've seen the H scenes. I see a lot of people talking about, oh, these H scenes are so horrible, just look at the writing. And at first it was funny, but then I got to thinking, how would you even know what a bad H scene is? What qualifies as a good or a bad H scene? For you to even know what that means would be either A, you read a lot of H scenes to begin with, or B, you're just some type of sexual icon, which you're probably neither. So you have no way to say, hey, this is a bad H scene, because that's not a fight and that's not the normal story. That's a completely different realm. My grotesque meat. I'll never forget those words. Fucking hilarious. Now, if you read a lot of scenes like that, then I'm not talking to you. But most of these guys aren't. Were they necessary? No. Nasu did what he had to do to help get his work out more, and the moment that he could take it away, he did. And you can tell how unnecessary it was when Rialto Nua came back around, and it felt like the H scenes didn't even exist. They were cool for the novelty of being there as the original fan, but all the things that he got to add without it, it made the novel so much better. So they're definitely just there. So I wouldn't say poor H scenes, I just say H scenes in general. Unless it is directly into the story, like Sakura's H scene. That has to happen, and this gets told really well in Rialto Nua how necessary those scenes are to show the mental distress of not only her, but her influence on Shiro as well, with her having these ties to Angra, and you can see that directly through the story. But if it's not doing that, and they're just smashing just to smash, I don't care for that. Never did. Are they funny at times? Yes, but realistically, I'm trying to read the story. If I wanted to watch that, I'd just watch it. Why is this here? Attempts at light-hearted humor to brighten the tone are always poor. They're not always poor. Like the bake-off scene in LB6. And this is a very good example. The bake-off scene in LB6 was very random. Super random. It almost felt like it came straight out of an FGO event. But you know what? I don't feel like it took anything away from the story. I understand that he wants to make it more engaging and he wants to have people feel more in tune with Artoria as a character and make her feel more like an actual person. Completely understandable. Was it a good scene? Sure. Was it a good scene for LB6? Probably not. I liked the scene. I thought it was fun, but it could have been done in a different way. I've definitely seen him do way worse. Or whatever the bird was doing in Mihoyo. Once again, in Mihoyo, Alice's bird isn't really an issue because it speaks to that empathetic side of her character that we don't really get to meet when we first see her. And the bird kind of represents that lighthearted tone that she doesn't really necessarily get to exhibit. He only ever got it right with Tsiah because her antics are never present in the serious part of the narrative. Yeah. I love Tsiah, and I've never felt like Tsiah has done something to impede on the work. When it's daytime, I know that they're gonna be, in the house, Shiro's gonna be cooking, Tsiah is gonna be up to her usual banter. It's just a good time. And my biggest pet peeve is overloading the last act with multiple overly long separate climax scenes, making the narrative less focused. When I think about the conclusions of Nasu, I never really feel like I walk away empty-handed. I'll say in the couple of routes of Tsukihime, I feel like things could have been implemented better with more gravitas. It does seem like he wasn't trying to overdo it, and a lot of that gets fixed in the remake. LB5 Part 2 was kind of like that. Sort of. That's not a pet peeve for me. I know a lot of people complain about that. They hated it. They feel like it was doing way too much in a very short amount of time. Not only that, but he wasn't the only person that wrote that. Majority of that was Sakurai, who wrote fragments and lost on Harriar, she did the greater half of that. As far as his endings by himself, I think Mihoyo's ending is very complex. Even when I try to explain it to people on the channel, a lot of people were lost. If you weren't reading up until that point, you're still lost because there's just so much going on. But that's kind of the point. The writing is meant to be dissected. Now, this whole overlapping thing, it was complex, but there wasn't multiple narratives overlapping. When he says that, I'm thinking more so of Yorubuchi with Zero or Strange Fate with Narita. But Nasu, he likes to get real into the nitty-gritty of a character instead of going tit for tat with everybody on the cast. That's why he did the routes in the first place, so he could hone in, because he knows that, and he can hone in on certain characters and just kill the other ones off and then rotate. Even with Kara no Kyokai, which is easily one of his most complex works, it's not that complex because it's all catered and focused on Shiki. There's not much to be lost about. Melty Blood, same way. Very focused. That's not really even his writing style, and I mean specifically for conclusions. Extella is about the closest I can think of. He kind of did do that with Extella, but again, he doesn't do it often, and I don't feel like Extella is bad, personally, any of them. I don't feel like none of that's bad. He definitely did that more often with the Extraverse, because once you get into the conclusion of Extra and Extella, there's a lot of things happening. Like a lot of things, but I like the ending of those, so that's not an issue for me. I think I know what people really want. I think the OG fans want a Fate Stay Night 2. It seems to me like a lot of people just really want a continuation of the first series with the post-time skip and tighter writing and less bloat. That's what it sounds like to me. I don't think they want Nasu to necessarily grow or try any new tricks or get out of his comfort zone. I think they really just want to refine what he had and stay in the same place. A lot of people, at least. Here's another one. More of a carryover from the earlier Type Moon days, but the abundance of sexual violence. It seemed like a cheap way to induce sympathy, and the overload of it caused it to lose its effect. Thankfully, it's been toned down in recent years, but it still sticks out to me. Yeah, 100%. 100%. That would definitely be one among the top. But again, you'd have to have been through all his works to really know how much he does it. He does it a lot. He does it a lot. At least he used to. And it does feel, like I said earlier, like additional shock factor. Bro, there's other ways. You know, a lot of people love to bring up the Fate route, but what they don't bring up is that Gil, in fact, was one of these people. He tries to take Saber a lot of the time that he's on the floor. Now, in his case, that's really who he was. Gil did take women non-consensual. That's just a part of his myth. So it's not like it's false. And I don't mean to be ugly, but back then, it wasn't really uncommon. But even though it's accurate to his lore, the way that he tries to do it in the story comes off as really jarring and unnecessary. So I'm wondering, is he gonna continue on this aspect in the remake or reshape the way that he did that? Now, some of it actually makes a lot of sense, like the background of Kohaku and Hisui. Really good. When it happened to Ryogi, it made a lot of sense to the development of her character, but sometimes it just goes a little too far. And for what? Here's another one. All of my criticism are things that I found he's already fixed as he grew more experienced. I honestly got 0 for modern Nasu, like the exposition dumps in the Fate route that was completely fixed with how he tackled Arc doing the same thing in Tsukihime. I can't really pinpoint how though. Yeah, this is pretty much where I'm at. I'm not looking at too much of the way that his writing goes as an insult. Bro, you wouldn't believe my shock to find out how many people thought Nasu wrote 0. Like, people were genuinely coming on that video saying, I thought Nasu was the one that wrote 0 in the first place. Now, I can understand sometimes it feels like writing blends together, but if you don't know if 2 different people are writing a story, something's wrong. Cause eventually at a point you gotta feel like, something feels a little off as to what I normally see. Like, the fact people thought Nasu genuinely wrote 0 is crazy to me, considering how different him and Yorubuchi writes, and the things that they choose to focus on. Now, if we just have to complain about exposition so much, one thing that used to get me was the redundancy over things that he's already covered, like beaten to submission. And I don't mean explaining mechanics, I mean overall plot points. Now, on one end, I can understand why a writer would think that repeating certain things would bring a certain dramatic effect, because sometimes that's true. And with him, sometimes it does. But then there's other times where it's like, it gets to a point where he repeats it so much that it becomes condescending. It's like, all right, bro, we got your point the first 20 times. Just because you keep saying it in different ways doesn't make it any more deep. It doesn't make it any more interesting. In the time that you spent repeating yourself for these bars, you could have put a whole nother scene and actually made it more interesting. I don't mind the exposition, especially in terms of being more detailed. It's him repeating certain elements without any expansion. And I also will say that I'm not a fan of when characters are introduced and nothing gets done with them. And I don't mean like it's a slow burn, we find out about them later. I mean like literally nothing happens with them. And there's a lot of those too. They either get reduced to lowly bait or gender bends or outright comedic effect. And they could have been really strong characters, strong in a writing sense, I mean, but now they're just that. The main things that we have here is exposition, the abundancy of sex, anything, and apparently power levels. Realistically, people are gonna bitch about power levels regardless of what series it is, but getting power crept out of relevancy is kind of irritating, because that's the only thing that certain characters lead with when they should have been leading with background to begin with.